This is Bill Levinson, and this presentation is on Henry Ford's Universal Code for World-Class Performance. This is a proven system for world-class performance in any enterprise, and will back that statement up with Henry Ford's results in the language of money. A quick overview: what is the Universal Code? Basically, it's an impartial, inarguable, synergistic, and universal triad of natural laws. Impartial is important because it's politically and ideologically nonpartisan. It's like the laws of nature, you can't argue with it. And it's also synergistic, which means its elements interact with each other. The economic aspect is the recognition that we can't get something for nothing. However, the scientific aspect allows us to get more from what we have. We can't get something from nothing, but we can get more from what we have. Finally, the behavioral element is extremely important, and it means that buy-in and commitment require a square deal for all stakeholders. If that square deal isn't there, people are not going to buy into it. This code works for all enterprises and services, not just manufacturing, but also service and other activities. The learning objectives for this presentation are as follows. First, quantify in the language of money, which is the language of upper management, the people in the organization who are going to have to buy into this, the effectiveness of Ford's Universal Code. This can also be used to gain buy-in from the organization and its supply chain. Also know and apply the economic, scientific, and behavioral aspects of the Universal Code. We also need to gain buy-in from other organizational stakeholders, including customers and supply chain partners. That's where the square deal aspect of the Universal Code comes into play. Teach coworkers and supply chain partners how to recognize many forms of waste on site. That's the scientific aspect that allows us to get more from what we have, although we can't get something from nothing. Okay, the first step is to look at Henry Ford's bottom line in the language of money. This is what you use to persuade upper management as well as other stakeholders whom you want to buy into this Universal Code. Okay, why should modern quality practitioners and executives be interested in the 90-year-old business model? Hasn't anything better come along since then? Well, the answer is actually no, and we're going to answer this question in the language of money. Nothing has really better has come along since then, although certainly there have been improvements on the scientific methods, such as aspects of the Toyota production system that were not developed at the Ford Motor Company, some advanced techniques, modern techniques, but the basic underlying model is still the same. There has to be something in this for everybody. That is going to tie in with the behavioral aspect of the Universal Code. There has to be something for everybody. Well, let's start with the investors. Ford's investors got a 35.2% annual capital gain on their money, not counting dividends. They invested $1. 16 years later, they got $125 on the dollar, plus whatever dividends they collected all the way. That's a pretty good investment. Okay, how about the workers who made all this happen? Hourly workers, 7.18% annual wage growth, and also a reduction of the work week to 5 days and 40 hours. It was once 6 days and more than 8 hours a day. The 5-day, 40-hour work week comes from Ford. And the workers got this without any need whatsoever for collective bargaining. What the customers got were steadily declining prices and higher quality, which in turn resulted in more sales. Again, this is a synergistic model. The three elements support each other, so giving the customers a square deal returned greater sales and greater profits even at lower prices. As far as the country was concerned, the wages and income from the Model T exceeded the wealth of 35 of the country's then 48 states. Now basically this shows that the Ford Motor Company and also the jobs in railroads and so on that rose to support the manufacture of automobiles made the United States the wealthiest and most powerful nation on earth. What we had then was simultaneous realization of lower prices, higher wages, and higher profits. In other words, something for everybody getting a square deal and more prosperity out of the Ford Motor Company. Also, the productivity of the Ford Motor Company was responsible for Allied victory in World War II, and there were even some cartoons from the First World War that showed how the Ford Motor Company's production was helping win the First World War. The key takeaway here is that Ford's Universal Code delivered world-class results, not only for the investors. We were talking, 35.2% annual growth in their investment, not counting dividends, but also higher wages for labor, 7.18% annual wage growth, without the need for unionization or collective bargaining, and declining prices and improving quality for customers. The next step then is to understand how he did all this. Now we're going to look at the Universal Code itself. Universal means exactly what it says. It's emphatically not specific to automobiles, and Ford made that clear in his book, My Life and Work, that this didn't relate just to the production of automobiles or even manufacturing. It's also applicable to services. Ford set up a hospital along industrial lines that rendered exemplary service and quality. Transportation, Ford had a railroad. Basically, it was bankrupt. Ford turned it into a profitable, high-service operation, and basically any other conceivable enterprise. The Universal Code, it's basically the laws of nature codified for management. It's impartial. In other words, it's not any political ideology or political party. It's also inarguable, just like the laws of nature, like the law of gravity. That means, in terms of getting it accepted, in terms of change management, all stakeholders have to accept it just like any other law of nature. And this impartial and inarguable nature of the Universal Code helps gain buy-in along with the language of money. It's also synergistic, which means its three elements are mutually supporting, whether for good or for bad. The three elements of the Universal Code are as follows. The economic law says we cannot get something for nothing. That should seem obvious, but there's plenty of political and other ideologies that say we can. That usually doesn't work out very well. And Rudyard Kipling's poem, The Gods of the Copybook Headings, is worth reading. It makes that very clear. We can't get something for nothing, and bad things happen when we try. The scientific law says we can get more from what we have through the removal of waste or muta. We can't get something for nothing, but we can get a lot more from what we have. Finally, there's the behavioral aspect. In order to get people to buy into this and make it work, you have to have a square deal for everybody. Labor, investors, customers, suppliers. If you don't have a square deal, the entire operation is going to fall apart. It's simply not going to work. Okay, let's look first at the economic law. We cannot have wealth that we don't produce, and there's a comic relief speech in King Henry VI from the rebel Jack Cade, who wanted to be king. He promised there would be 7 half-penny loaves sold for a penny. When he was king, he would decree this. He would decree that the 3-hooped pot would have 10 hoops. In other words, the pot size depended on the number of hoops, and you would pay the value of 3 hoops for a pot that held 10 hoops. A stream would run with claret wine. At this point, it's getting obviously ridiculous. And this was basically comic relief. Shakespeare built speeches like this into his plays to appeal to the groundlings. They were called groundlings because they were lower class people who had to sit on the ground because they couldn't afford theater seats. So this was really designed to appeal to the least sophisticated members of Shakespeare's audiences, and they laughed at this because they knew it was ridiculous. Maybe they couldn't read or write, but they still knew that this proposition was ridiculous. However, in 2000, France mandated 40 hours of pay for 35 hours of work. In other words, they had this ideology that said you could get 40 hours of pay for 35 hours of work. Obviously, that did not work out very well because employers simply outsourced the jobs under those circumstances. Well, the effects of this are, or at least should be, obvious. If you have price controls, we know that those lead either to shortages, people simply won't sell, or black markets, people sell it outside the approved channels. And employers and customers certainly aren't going to pay 40 hours of wages for 35 hours of work unless we use the scientific law, which comes next, to figure out how to do 40 hours of work in 35 hours. Actually, it's been proven you could do what was previously 40 hours of work in 20 hours, and in some cases 10 or even 5 hours as you remove more and more waste from the job. And we'll talk about that more with the scientific law. This is another case where Kipling's poem is highly instructive. The Dutch speculated in tulip bulbs. The prices kept going up. They were actually astronomical, and then the whole market collapsed. Speculation in stocks, we learned where that went in 1929 with the Great Depression. Dot-com stocks, people were buying stocks that had never produced a penny of earnings. They were just being bought on speculation. Mortgage-backed securities was how we got the mess back, I believe, in 2008 when the stock market went down the tubes. And it's also been proposed to trade carbon credits. None of these activities produce wealth. All this is ideology, speculation, and Ford warned very explicitly against speculation because it does not produce wealth, and eventually somebody is going to get caught holding the bag. Something that unions need to understand is labor cannot bargain collectively for wealth it does not produce. If it does, if it forces the employer to pay more value than the job produces, then the company will go out of business and the jobs won't be there, or else the employer will move the jobs somewhere else, and workers who bargain collectively won't have the jobs at that point either. However, how can labor get those higher wages? The scientific law allows the supply chain to produce more wealth for everybody. That means the job produces more value. The employer can then charge lower prices, pay higher wages, and make higher profits simultaneously, just like Henry Ford did. Now we'll look at scientific law and lean manufacturing. Most jobs contain enormous amounts of waste, and the waste is asymptomatic. Asymptomatic is a good word. It means without symptoms. If you have scrap or rework or customer complaints, that's going to cause organizational pain and an incentive to do something about it. However, you can be producing high quality, but with an enormous amount of waste. For example, as Ford said about waste of time, you can have people spending half their day walking back and forth to get and move parts. The job is still getting done, so nobody thinks to challenge the way the job is being done. This is extremely important, and Ford realized some of his best results by eliminating waste of time. Let's look at bricklaying, which is one of the world's oldest trades. This animation shows how people once used to lay bricks, and actually there are movies from the beginning of the 20th century that show people doing exactly this. I'm not making this up. And they could lay about 125 bricks per hour in this manner. and the walls obviously got built. There didn't seem to be any problem with the job because the walls obviously got built. But what's wrong with this picture? Like I said, I'm not making this up. This is a photo from Frank Gilbreth's motion study published in 1911. These workers are laying bricks. This is a simplified illustration of Gilbreth's non-stooping scaffold. Actually, the worker didn't have to lift the bricks from the top. I saw a picture of this, and it was designed sort of with a slot underneath the brick so you could put your hand in. It was very easy to grab the brick, and now we're laying 350 bricks per hour instead of 125 bricks per hour, and the worker obviously is not straining his back muscles by doing, 125 leg lifts or squats per hour. Well, this is how the employer can pay the worker 2 hours of wages for 1 hour of work and also charge lower prices to the customer. Just get the waste out of the job. This is an actual photograph of Gilbreth's non-stooping scaffold. Here's another animation of a job. This is based on a description from a book written in 1911 called How Scientific Management is Applied. The job involved taking fabric from one table, putting it on the table in the middle, folding it, and putting the folded fabric on the outgoing table. And the description was as follows: but all employees took 2 steps to the right to secure their cloth, returned to the tables, folded the stuff, and deposited it on another pile 2 steps to the left. This had always been the practice. No one had ever thought to question it. And somebody looked at this and they said, well, if we move these tables closer together, we could eliminate all that walking. It turned out the workers could do twice as much work because they weren't spending their time walking. Henry Ford said, by the way, that no job should require anybody to take more than 1 step in any direction or to bend over at the waist. Material waste can also hide in plain view, just like waste of time. There was a company, as a matter of fact, that contributed to an article on a high agility machine tool, and they bragged about how much of the aluminum stock this machine cut into chips. Well, at the Ford Motor Company, if somebody saw machining chips in the waste bin, well, they know that that's from getting the job done, but they say, why do we have to cut up all that metal? Is there a different way to get the job done so we don't have to cut the stock into chips? Even though the chips were recycled in the blast furnace, they regarded this as wasteful. Ford himself was driving with one of his employees, Harry Bennett, past a pile of slag from his blast furnace, and Ford noticed there was rust in the slag, and he said, well, wait a minute, that's iron, and the blast furnace is supposed to recover the iron. Why is my iron in the waste pile? So they found out that some of the iron was getting out of the blast furnaces, and they put in electromagnets to recover the iron particles. It saved like 0.5%, but when you're making thousands of tons, that becomes pretty significant. It becomes a significant amount of money. Norwood wrote a book called Ford Men and Methods in 1931, and he used the phrase, it worried the men, at least twice in this book with regard to, say, machining waste and other forms of waste. There was a culture in which people noticed the waste and did something about it. Ford also practiced methods to avoid making the waste, or if he had to make the waste, find a use for it. How can he resell it? For example, the slag from the blast furnaces was made into cement and paving material. Kingsford charcoal, which is still sold today, was what happened to the wood from Ford's operations. Assuming there was no other possible use for the wood, he distilled it, sold the wood chemicals, including methyl alcohol, and sold the charcoal. Ford also used returnable containers. That was another advance that he made. Okay, I just mentioned distillation of waste wood. That yielded $12,000 per day in the money of the 1920s. That was when the dollars were still made out of silver, and that was enough to pay 2,000 workers a relatively high wage of $6 a day. Again, no job was to require anybody to take more than one step in any direction or bend over. Okay, question for the day. If these methods worked so well, then why did Ford run into labor relations trouble, including violent labor relations trouble, during the late 1930s? And the answer turns out that his successors went against the behavioral law, which we're going to look at next, which requires a square deal for all stakeholders in the supply chain. Okay, behavioral law. This is an important aspect of the Universal Code. Okay, this is a picture from the, I think, early 19th century, and these are cloth-making machines, looms, automated looms. Now, why are these guys trying to smash the textile machinery? These people who are trying to smash the machines were known as Luddites, and they were against automation. They were actually against productivity improvements. Now, at the turn of the 19th century, they had 100-fold productivity improvements from the power loom and punch card loom. The jacquard loom, by the way, is the basis of the punch card for the computers of the 1960s and 1970s. The punch cards were originally designed to tell looms what to do, like where to put the threads, and computer manufacturers later adopted that technology to operate computers. The benefits of this productivity improvement were not, however, shared with the workers, and the workers were afraid that automation would take their jobs away, so they actually went so far as to destroy the machinery. And there's other forms of Luddism that don't require an actual crime, such as destruction of property. There are also non-destructive and non-violent methods to oppose automation, and they still happen today, so it's important to know about them. Obviously, destroying the employer's property is a serious criminal offense, so workers found other ways to resist productivity improvements. Soldiering, which means marking time like soldiers marching in place, is a non-destructive form of Luddism. In other words, deliberately limiting productivity. Restrictive work rules, as demanded by unions, like one person can't touch another person's job, and the purpose of this is to protect jobs. That's another legal and non-violent form of Luddism. This is a quote from an article written in 2002, the long and shoreman of it, in Capitalism magazine, and it quotes on the pre-modern waterfront from the Wall Street Journal, which unfortunately is no longer available. ILWU is the International Longshore and Warehouse Union. Obviously that's 21st century Luddism. Frederick Winslow Taylor explained very clearly the source of Luddism in 1911 in his Principles of Scientific Management. Now, they paid workers by the piece, so what the employers would do, if they figured out how to make twice as many pieces per hour, the employer would cut the piece rate by half so as to not have to pay the workers any more money, and the workers figured out pretty quickly that they were not getting a square deal out of this. They were making twice as much value, but they weren't getting any more pay, so they would engage in soldiering, deliberately limiting productivity. Henry Ford said pretty much the same thing in his book, My Life and Work, and the lesson then is Luddites are almost universally creations of the employer. The employer has done something, and it's pretty identifiable, not sharing the gains with the workers, to cause the workers to resist productivity improvements and deliberately limit productivity. Okay, now they have college programs in industrial and labor relations. That's a 4-year curriculum. with today's tuition rates, depending on the university, could easily cost more than $100,000. Henry Ford taught us everything we need to know about industrial and labor relations in one sentence, except obviously for the legal aspects of labor law, like things like workers' compensation, unemployment, insurance, and so on. But other than that, here's everything you need to know about industrial and labor relations in a single sentence. And it worked when Ford was in charge of the Ford Motor Company, because that's what happened. As productivity improved, he shared the gains with the workers, and the workers didn't even have to ask for it. Now, many, if not most, productivity improvements come from the shop floor, because the people who do the job 8 hours a day are in the best position to notice waste and other opportunities for improvement. So you need the shop floor to buy into this, and this requires a no layoff policy. Modern lean practitioners point this out, and it's also pretty clear that Ford had a no layoff policy, and also that his successors circumvented it at about the time they started to have labor relations troubles at Ford. Also, productivity improvements are reflected in the workers' paychecks. So the success of a lean program, lean manufacturing, requires elimination of restrictive work rules as demanded by unions and other forms of Luddism, and those forms of Luddism exist when the employer does not give the workers a square deal. The two things are directly related. Okay, the synergy of the three laws, economic, scientific, and behavioral. If labor gets a square deal, it will support improved productivity, higher profits, and lower customer prices. If the workers on the shop floor know that if you improve productivity, it will show up in your paycheck, then you'll look for ways to improve productivity and eliminate waste. On the other hand, if labor does not get a square deal, let's say they lay people off when productivity improves, and that apparently began to happen in the late 1930s at Ford. The people in charge found ways to circumvent Ford's no layoff rule. Obviously, workers are going to look for ways to make sure that the productivity improvements don't happen through various forms of Luddism. The square deal also has to extend to the supply chain. There are complaints nowadays about customers that squeeze suppliers, basically demand lower prices from their suppliers without giving them any help as to how to reduce their own costs. So that means they have to pay lower wages, maybe cut corners on quality, and perhaps even be driven out of business, at which point you no longer have a supplier. On the other hand, you can develop your supplier, help your supplier reduce costs, increase wages, and also make more money, which was Henry Ford's approach. It worked beautifully. It worked absolutely great when Ford did it that way. Zero-based pricing means that a customer will not accept price increases from a supplier without ample justification. In other words, they tell the supplier you are absolutely not entitled to an annual price increase or anything like that. There was a situation that Ford had where C.R. Wilson, a auto body manufacturer, wanted $152 per body. Ford said, "I'll pay you $72, and Wilson said, "That's ridiculous. It cost me more than that to make the bodies." Ford's production chief, Charles Sorensen, who was one of the main drivers of Ford's lean manufacturing system, came in and said, "Well, here's how you can make them for $50 each," which meant Wilson got $22 in profit from each body. And it turned out that Wilson then made higher profits than he would have made from his $152 price, but with all the waste that was built into his original process, Wilson was also able to pay higher wages to his workers, and Ford, of course, got the price that he wanted. $72 per body, so everybody came out ahead as a result. Okay, the behavioral law is extremely important, and the natural laws of human behavior can either make the lean manufacturing program work, which means everybody gets more money out of it, more profits, lower prices, higher wages, higher quality, basically everything good. On the other hand, if you go against these natural laws of human behavior, you can conceivably destroy your entire supply chain. This underscores the synergistic nature of the three aspects of Ford's Universal Code. The next section will cover the Universal Code and social responsibility. Okay, let's look at how the Universal Code ties in with social responsibility. I've seen, I don't know how many pages, statements on social responsibility, essays, and so on. This section will give a one-sentence social responsibility policy that any organization can use. Okay, here is a one-sentence social responsibility policy, and it comes from Ford and Crowther, My Life and Work. And there's also one from Ford and Crowther, Today and Tomorrow, written in 1926, that says buyer and seller must both be wealthier in some way as a result of a transaction, else the balance is broken. We have yet to learn the antisocial nature of any business transaction that is not just and profitable all around. There's your social responsibility statement in one, or in the case of the one I just read to you, 2 sentences. Simple, easy to understand. Square deal for everybody. That's basically what Ford is saying. Social responsibility is therefore an expression of the Universal Code's requirement for a square deal for everybody in your supply chain. That means lower prices and higher quality for your customers, fair rate recompense for your suppliers, high profits for your investors, and high wages for your employees. Square deal all around. There's social responsibility right there. Okay, we'll summarize in the next few slides. Henry Ford's Universal Code for Business Leadership is basically a synergistic, impartial, nonpartisan, and inarguable triad of economic, scientific, and behavioral laws. Its success, in the language of money, is incontrovertible. Ford did it. He proved it can work. He proved it worked better than anything else. Basically, he made the United States into the wealthiest and most powerful nation on earth, made it possible for an hourly worker to own a house and a car and raise a family on one income. That also happened on Ford's watch. Basically created the American middle class, so there's no argument that this worked. Its proven effectiveness then can help gain buy-in and acceptance from the organization and the supply chain in which it operates. We also showed it was impartial. It's not an ideology. It's basically the laws of nature, just like Rudyard Kipling's Gods of the Copybook headings. That means everybody has to accept it. They can't argue with it. Economic law says we cannot get something for nothing, and once we understand that, unions will understand that collective bargaining cannot bring high wages unless the union figures out how to produce the wealth that would justify those higher wages. And then they have to get rid of things like restrictive work rules, resistance to automation, and other forms of Luddism. On the other hand, when we get to the behavioral law, the employer has to realize that the employer has to give labor a square deal, because these two things are directly connected. We can't legislate wealth, we can't print wealth, and speculation does not produce wealth either. Wealth has to be produced. The scientific law shows, however, that we can get far more from what we have by eliminating waste, that's the idea of lean manufacturing. Behavioral law says that everybody in the supply chain has to get a square deal, and again, the effect is synergistic. If you get a square deal, you get buy-in and commitment from all participants that causes people to remove waste, look for ways to remove even more waste, improve productivity, improve quality, improve service, which generates a cycle of increased wealth, profits, wages for everybody. On the other hand, if you have an unfair deal, you get soldiering, Loveism, and opt-out at the earliest opportunity. It's conceivable that if matters get bad enough, you could lose everybody in the supply chain, all the customers and suppliers go out of business because somebody else who is adhering to Ford's universal code is doing the job properly, giving better value to their customers, and basically then taking all the business. Ford's results prove unequivocally, of course, that we should choose the first option. Thank you for listening, and I hope this presentation has been useful.